New York, 1971. Behind the scenes of glittering arenas, betrayal was festering. Joe Frazier was the reigning champion who secretly supported Muhammad Ali with money and influence, while Ali was in exile for refusing to fight in Vietnam. But as soon as Ali earned the right to fight, he turned friendship into fuel for hatred. Before the eyes of all America, Ali publicly branded Frazier an Uncle Tom and a puppet of white people, framing him as a traitor to his race.
Frazier's personal hurt became deeper than any scar from boxing gloves.
The first fight at Madison Square Garden turned into a personal vendetta. Frazier sent Ali into a heavy knockdown and won. But the price of that victory was 2 years of recovery and forever poisoned relations. The city hummed with a violent energy that bypassed the typical sports hype, crossing into the territory of a cultural civil war. Frazier had been the man who lobbied the boxing commissions to let Ali back into the ring, even lending him cash when the government had stripped him of his livelihood. He viewed Ali as a brother in arms, a fellow gladiator who understood the weight of the crown. That illusion shattered under the white-hot lights of television cameras. Ali recognized that to reclaim his status as a global icon, he needed a villain, and he chose the man who had fed him. He orchestrated a smear campaign that targeted Frazier's dignity, intelligence, and blackness. Every interview became a platform for psychological warfare, where Ali used his wit like a serrated blade to dehumanize a man whose only crime was being the champion in Ali's absence. The betrayal manifested in the streets and gyms where Frazier had once been respected. He found himself booed by his own community, casualties of Ali's rhetorical genius. The pressure built until the air in Madison Square Garden felt combustible on the night of the fight. When the bell rang, it wasn't just a technical contest of skill. It was a release of years of repressed fury. Frazier fought with the desperation of a man trying to reclaim his soul from a bully. He absorbed devastating combinations, his face swelling into a distorted mask of crimson and purple, but he kept moving forward. He was fueled by a cold, righteous anger that Ali had failed to calculate. In the final round, the culmination of Ali's insults met the reality of Frazier's left hook. The punch landed with a sound that echoed through the history of the sport, dropping the seemingly invincible Ali to the canvas. It was the definitive moment of the decade, a physical rebuttal to the verbal abuse that had preceded it. Frazier won the unanimous decision, cementing his place as the undisputed king, but the victory felt like ashes. The damage inflicted on both men was systemic and irreversible. Frazier left the arena and went straight to a hospital bed, his body broken by the sheer volume of punishment he had endured to prove a point. Ali, though defeated, refused to retract his words, choosing instead to double down on the narrative that Frazier was an illegitimate champion. The brotherhood was dead, replaced by a dark, symbiotic bond of mutual resentment that would define the next 4 decades of their lives. The wounds on their faces healed within weeks, but the internal damage from the betrayal at the heart of the world's greatest rivalry had only just begun to fester, setting the stage for a cycle of vengeance that neither man was prepared to end. 1975 year, Philippines. The third and decisive fight, which went down in history as the Thriller in Manila. In the hall, the temperature hit 40 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity, turning the ring into a steam room. Ali continued his mockery, calling his opponent a gorilla. During 14 rounds, the two men systematically destroyed each other. This was no longer a sport, but legalized murder. By the end of the fight, Frazier could see practically nothing due to hematomas, and Ali was on the verge of collapse, whispering in his corner that this state was the closest thing to death. When Frazier's coach forcibly stopped the fight, Ali collapsed unconscious immediately after the victory was announced. Both emerged from this hell forever broken physically. The atmosphere inside the Philippine Coliseum was thick with a suffocating dampness that made breathing feel like inhaling hot lead. Under the blinding lights, the ring became an island of pure agony where every movement required a monumental effort of will. Ali had spent the weeks leading up to the encounter sharpening his tongue, mocking Frazier with a cruelty that surpassed their previous meetings. But once the first bell rang, the talking stopped, and the slaughter began. Frazier moved forward like a relentless machine of vengeance, ignoring the sharp, stinging jabs that snapped his head back, while Ali stood his ground, forced to endure a level of physical punishment that defied human logic. The crowd was a wall of noise, but for the two men in the square, the world had narrowed down to the sound of heavy leather hitting bone and the rhythmic gasping for air. By the middle rounds, the heat had reached a lethal intensity, sucking the moisture from their muscles and turning their blood into sludge. Frazier's face began to lose its human shape, his eyes swelling into thin slits as Ali's precision punches landed with surgical brutality. Yet Frazier did not falter, landing crushing blows to Ali's ribs and kidneys that made the champion's vision blur and his heart stutter. Every exchange was a transaction in pain, a mutual agreement to trade years of their lives for a single moment of dominance. The canvas became slick with a mixture of sweat, water, and blood, making every step a gamble against gravity. As the fight entered the championship rounds, the brutality shifted into a psychological realm of suffering. Ali was no longer dancing. He was leaning against the ropes, absorbing hooks that would have leveled city walls, his body vibrating with the impact of Frazier's hatred. In the opposite corner, Frazier was navigating a world of darkness, his left eye completely closed and his right eye narrowing to a point where he could only see the shadow of his enemy. They were two ghosts haunting a ring, driven by a pride that refused to allow them to sit down. The air was so stagnant that the cornerman's fans only pushed the heat deeper into their lungs. In the 14th round, Ali unleashed a final, desperate barrage that turned Frazier's head into a speed bag. Yet Joe stayed on his feet, guided only by the sound of Ali's breathing and the instinct of a lifetime spent in the trenches. When the round ended, the carnage had reached its limit. Frazier sat on his stool, a broken titan, unable to see the hands of his trainer in front of his face. Eddie Futch looked at his fighter, seeing the permanent damage etched into his swollen features, and realized that another 3 minutes would likely end in a funeral. Despite Frazier's muffled protests to continue, Futch stopped the slaughter, saving his man from his own bravery. Across the ring, Ali heard the news of the surrender. He tried to stand, to raise his arms in triumph for the cameras, but the strength had finally drained out of his marrow. He fell to the floor like a felled oak, his mind slipping into a dark void where the roar of the arena couldn't reach him. The victory was official, but it carried no joy. His internal organs were bruised, his nervous system was shattered, and the first tremors of a future shadow began to creep into his hands. They had pushed each other past the boundaries of the human soul, leaving pieces of themselves on that blood-soaked mat in Manila that they would never get back. The rivalry had reached its peak of violence, leaving both champions as hollowed-out versions of the legends they once were, forever shackled to the memory of that morning in the heat. Decades pass. Ali's fame grows, but his body begins to slowly crumble under the blows of Parkinson's disease. He becomes a global icon, yet in Frazier's interviews, an undisguised malice still resonates. Joe cannot forget the humiliations of the 70s. He openly gloats over Ali's ailment, seeing it as divine retribution for his rival's sharp tongue. Ali, trapped in the cocoon of his own numbing body, begins a long journey toward religion and humility. While one accumulates anger, the other learns to be silent. They avoid meetings, and the world is certain that this war will only end along with their lives. The passage of time did nothing to dull the sharp edges of the resentment that lived in the basement of Joe Frazier's heart. While the rest of the planet began to sanctify Muhammad Ali as a secular saint of peace and civil rights, Joe remained a lonely holdout in a Philadelphia gym, staring at the walls and remembering the sting of being called an animal. Every time the cameras caught Ali with a trembling hand or a frozen, mask-like expression, Frazier felt a dark sense of cosmic justice.
He spoke to journalists with a bitterness that shocked the public, claiming that the man who had once been the fastest talker in the world was now paying the price for every lie he had told. For Joe, the tremors were not a medical tragedy, but a bill that had finally come due. He carried the insults like stones in his pockets, refusing to set them down even as his own hair turned gray and his gait slowed. To him, Ali was still the bully who had stolen his dignity in front of the world, and no amount of international acclaim could erase the memory of the betrayal. Meanwhile, the silence around Ali became his new reality. The man who had once dominated every room with a hurricane of words was now forced into a profound, involuntary stillness. As his nervous system frayed, Ali retreated into a space of deep spiritual reflection. He traded the roar of the crowd for the quiet study of the Quran, seeking to reconcile the arrogance of his youth with the frailty of his present. The physical world, which he had once conquered with such ease, was now a treacherous landscape where a flight of stairs was a mountain and a simple sentence was a marathon. He watched the footage of his old fights with a detached sense of wonder, as if observing a stranger from a different lifetime. He became aware of the weight of his past actions, the collateral damage of his climb to the top, and the specific, heavy shadow of Joe Frazier. He did not respond to Joe's public outbursts of vitriol. He simply let the anger wash over him, using the silence as a form of penance. The two men existed on opposite poles of a broken bridge. Frazier lived in a state of perpetual friction, fueled by a rage that kept his spirit hot, but his soul isolated. He saw Ali's global veneration as a personal affront, a collective amnesia that ignored the cruelty of the man behind the myth. Ali lived in a state of forced equilibrium, his spirit cooling as his body solidified. He became a vessel for the world's empathy, but he knew that the one man whose forgiveness he needed most was the one man who seemed incapable of giving it. They moved through the same boxing circles like ghost ships, their orbits never crossing, their mutual friends careful never to mention one name in the presence of the other. The public grew used to this stalemate, accepting the idea that the greatest rivalry in sports history was destined to remain an open wound until the very end. The silence was not peace. It was merely a temporary ceasefire in a war that had moved from the ring into the blood and the bone. As the years turned into decades, the distance between them seemed to grow into an unbridgeable chasm, cemented by a pride that refused to break and a pain that refused to heal, leaving the final chapter of their shared history unwritten and seemingly impossible. November 2011. A bolt from the blue. Iron Joe Frazier is diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. Doctors give him only a few days. In Phoenix, Muhammad Ali receives this news from his wife. At that moment, his old pride finally crumbles. Despite the fact that Ali can hardly move and almost cannot speak, he makes an instantaneous decision to fly to the man he had called his enemy for decades. There is no time for formalities. The realization that his main rival is leaving without receiving an apology becomes an unbearable burden for Ali. The quiet of the desert morning in Arizona was shattered by the weight of a single phone call. For Ali, the news acted as a brutal clarity that cut through the fog of his own physical suffering. The Parkinsonian tremors that usually dominated his existence seemed to fade into the background as a different kind of urgency took hold of his spirit. He sat in his armchair, a silhouette of his former power, and looked at the television that often replayed the highlights of a life lived at maximum volume. The images of him mocking Joe, the laughter of the press at Frazier's expense, and the cold, hard stares they had exchanged over 40 years flashed through his mind like a distorted reel of sins. He realized that the clock which had been ticking since Manila was now in its final seconds. The resentment that had felt like a defensive wall for so long suddenly looked like a prison. There was no debate in his mind, no hesitation born of the logistical nightmares his condition created.
To travel meant a grueling ordeal of wheelchairs, specialized transport, and the exhausting toll on a nervous system that was already failing. Yet Ali signaled his intent with a terrifying focus in his eyes that his family hadn't seen in years. He understood that death was about to close a door that only he had the key to unlock. The grand narrative of the greatest boxer was incomplete as long as Joe Frazier lay in a hospice bed with a heart full of unaddressed pain. The pride that had fueled his ascent to the top of the world was replaced by a desperate, humble need to make things right before the final bell. He felt the crushing weight of every word he had used to dehumanize Joe, every joke that had landed harder than a physical punch, and every year of silence that had allowed the poison to spread. The journey began in a blur of sterile terminals and the rhythmic thumping of medical equipment. Ali was a prisoner of his body, but his will was a runaway train headed toward Philadelphia. He ignored the fatigue that threatened to pull him into a deep, dark sleep, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon. The world outside the airplane window moved at a pace he could no longer match, but internally, he was racing against a biological countdown. He thought of Joe not as the champion he had fought, but as the man who had stood by him when no one else would, the man he had betrayed for the sake of a spectacle. The realization that he might arrive too late, that the silence might become eternal, was a sharper agony than any physical symptom. As the plane descended into the gray chill of the Northeast, the reality of the situation settled over him like a heavy shroud. He was no longer the king coming to claim a city. He was a petitioner seeking mercy from a man he had spent a lifetime wounding. The iron-willed Frazier was fading, and Ali knew that his presence was the only thing that could offer a different ending to their tragic story. The formalities of his status, the security details, and the public persona were stripped away, leaving only a frail man possessed by a singular, sacred mission. He had spent his life fighting for titles, for causes, and for his own legend. But this final flight was for something far more elusive. He was flying toward a hospital room to face the ghost of his own making, carrying a weight of regret that only a final, face-to-face encounter could lift. The battle was no longer in the ring, but in the quiet, desperate hope that he could reach his brother before the light went out forever. Hospital ward in a hospice. Sterile light and the sound of medical equipment. The meeting of two shadows of great champions takes place without witnesses or the press. Ali, whose body is racked by incessant shaking, overcomes the distance to Frazier's bed. In this space, there is no longer the greatest and the gorilla. There are only two old men. Ali finds the strength to sink to his knees, performing an act of supreme humility. Without unnecessary witnesses, a ritual of confession occurs. Ali, through gestures and broken sounds, asks for forgiveness for every word spoken. Frazier, whose life force is almost exhausted, finds the strength to touch Ali's hand, letting go of 40 years of hatred. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the looming presence of the inevitable. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was the only spectator to a scene that the world's media would have traded everything to capture. Yet it remained a sacred, private sanctuary. Ali moved with an agonizing slowness, his nervous system fighting against every inch of progress. But his eyes were fixed on the frail figure beneath the white sheets. Joe Frazier, once an unstoppable force of nature, looked small, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin stretched thin over the bones of a titan. As Ali reached the edge of the bed, the 40 years of vitriol, the televised insults, and the cold silence of decades seemed to evaporate in the heat of the moment. There was no ego left to defend, no championship belt to protect, only the raw vulnerability of two men facing the final curtain. When Ali lowered himself to the floor, it was a physical manifestation of a spiritual collapse. The knees that had once danced around the world's most dangerous fighters now hit the linoleum with a heavy, hollow thud. From this position of absolute weakness, Ali looked up at the man he had spent a lifetime dehumanizing. He did not speak in sentences, The illness had stolen his eloquence long ago, but the sounds that escaped him were more profound than any poem. They were guttural, rhythmic moans of sorrow, punctuated by the frantic shaking of his hands. He pointed to his own chest and then to Joe, his face contorting with the effort of expressing a lifetime of regret. Every tear that fell from Ali's eyes carried the weight of 1,000 headlines he had used to hurt his friend. He was a king, surrendering his crown at the feet of the person he had most wronged. Frazier watched him through eyes that were dimmed by morphine and the encroaching darkness of the end. For a long moment, he remained motionless, as if weighing the decades of pain against the broken man on the floor. The anger that had been his constant companion, the fuel that had kept his heart beating through years of neglect, began to soften. He saw in Ali not a rival, but a mirror of his own mortality. With an effort that seemed to drain the last of his energy, Frazier moved his arm. His fingers, thickened by 1,000 battles, slowly unfurled and settled atop Ali's trembling hand. The contact was electric, a grounding wire for 40 years of static lightning. In that touch, the war ended. The bitterness that had poisoned Frazier's spirit for nearly half a century dissolved into a quiet, profound peace. He did not need to hear clear words to understand the apology. He felt it in the vibration of the hand beneath his. The grip was weak, but it was the firmest bond they had ever shared, stronger than any clinch in a prize ring. They stayed like that for a long time. Two broken warriors anchored to one another in the quiet of the ward. The silence was no longer an absence of speech, but a presence of understanding. The shadows on the wall stretched long as the afternoon sun faded, marking the close of the most violent and beautiful chapter in the history of the sport. The hatred was gone, replaced by a deep, symbiotic recognition that they were two halves of a whole, finally made complete by the simple, terrifying act of forgiveness. The finale arrived with a swift and quiet finality. Before leaving the room, Ali performed a symbolic gesture. He removed his personal prayer bracelet and placed it on Frazier's wrist as an amulet for the final journey. The next morning, Joe Frazier died. On his hand remained the gift from the man who had been his closest enemy. Frazier's death put a period on the loudest feud in sports history, transforming it into a story about the most difficult human act, the ability to forgive and ask for forgiveness when the round is already effectively over. The room grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long geometric shadows across the linoleum floor. Ali lingered at the bedside, his eyes lingering on the metal links of the bracelet that now circled Joe's thin wrist. The weight of the moment transcended the physical boundaries of the hospital. For years, that bracelet had been a constant companion to Ali's own struggles, a silent witness to his private prayers and the steady decline of his motor skills. Giving it away was not a mere act of charity. It was a transfer of spirit, a final surrender of the ego that had once demanded the world call him the greatest. He watched Joe's chest rise and fall in a shallow, rhythmic struggle, and for the first time in his life, Ali felt no need to fill the silence with noise. The peace that settled between them was heavy and absolute, a sharp contrast to the thunderous roar of the crowds that had once fueled their mutual destruction. As Ali was wheeled out of the hospice, the cold night air of Philadelphia hit him like a physical blow. He looked back at the nondescript building, knowing with a terrifying certainty that he would never see Joe again in this life. The connection they shared, forged in the fires of Madison Square Garden and the suffocating heat of Manila, had finally been stripped of its jagged edges. The journey back was a blur of motion and fatigue, but the spiritual lightness Ali felt was unmistakable. The burden he had carried since the 70s, the hidden shame of his cruelty toward a man who had once been his benefactor, had been replaced by a somber, quiet clarity. He had closed the circle. The warrior had finally laid down his arms, not in defeat, but in a victory far more profound than any knockout. When the news of Frazier's passing broke the following morning, it rippled across the globe like a shockwave. The world began to recount the statistics, the knockdowns, and the bitter quotes that had defined the era. They spoke of the legendary left hook and the sheer willpower of the man from Beaufort. But inside the quiet of the funeral home, the reality was much simpler and more intimate. Joe lay in repose, the fierce lines of his face finally smoothed by the hand of death. And there, resting against his skin, was the silver and beads of Ali's bracelet. It was a silent testament to a hidden truth, a secret shared between two men who had spent their lives trying to break each other, only to find that they were the only two people who truly understood the cost of their journey. The funeral became a theater of collective memory, but for Ali, who sat among the mourners as a silent, trembling witness, it was a private reckoning. He watched as they lowered his brother into the earth, realizing that a part of himself was being buried in that casket as well. The rivalry was dead, but the story had been rewritten. It was no longer a chronicle of hate and exploitation, but a testament to the endurance of the human heart. They had fought for titles and for money, for fame and for pride. But in the final seconds of their shared timeline, they had fought for something much harder to obtain. They had fought for the grace to let go. As the last shovelful of dirt fell, the legacy of the two greatest champions became a single, unified narrative of redemption. The man who had once used words as weapons had finally used a simple object to heal a wound that the entire world thought was permanent. The final bell had rung, and in the end, there were no losers, only two men who had finally found the peace that the ring could never provide.